Spring is arguably the best time of year for fly fishing. The fish are waking up after a long winter, it's not freezing outside anymore, and the bug hatches get insane. Most of my favorite fly fishing moments, from incredible hatches to huge fish, happen during spring. This is the kind of action you do not want to miss out on. To help you take advantage of this great spring fishing, I've put together a list of the top performing flies for this time of year. These are flies that I actually use. I've been fly fishing for over 20 years, and these are the patterns that keep putting fish in the net. I can't wait to see what they do for you. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. Years ago, I was out in Oregon with my buddies Ryan McCullough, Mysis Mike Kingsbury, and then Ryan's son Josh. We were out there, it was the second weekend of March, and we'd picked this weather window where it was overcast, which is a slight chance for rain, and very little wind. Those are the ideal conditions you want for an early season blue-winged olive mayfly hatch, which obviously that's what we were there hoping to run into. The only problem is that it was about noon. We'd been fishing all morning, and the blue wings hadn't shown up yet. There was zero sign that these bugs were actually going to show up that day. The fish weren't very active either. It was as if the entire river was just holding its breath, waiting for a hatch that may or may not happen. Well, I asked Ryan and Mike if they wanted to move to a different spot, a spot we call the Oak Tree Run, which usually fishes well even if there's not an active hatch going on. Both Ryan and Mike surprised me, though, because they said they wanted to stay where we were and see what happens. So I stayed. I kept fishing, kept throwing what felt like fruitless cast after fruitless cast. It started to drizzle a little bit, so I zipped up my coat and I kept fishing. And usually, most of the blue-winged olive hatches that I have experienced myself, They come off in fits and spurts. You'll see one bug, then two bugs, and then a dozen bugs, and it takes a minute for the fish to slowly warm up to this idea of a buffet of bugs. They'll tentatively rise to those bugs at first, and then eventually they will turn into just like me at a wing joint. They'll lose all their inhibition, stuff themselves so full they can't move, and then they'll regret every life decision that brought them to that point. But this hatch was a little bit different. I was about to head to the car for a snack when from upstream I hear Mike holler, "Fish on!" So I look up, and sure enough, he's hooked up into what looks like just a really good fish. And in that instant, when he hooked up, it was like a switch flipped, and the river was just swarmed with mayflies. They were everywhere. The fish started rising without any care in the world, and for the next 5 hours, we fished ourselves silly. It was a surreal experience to be there because we were catching fish on any half decent drift. It wasn't one of those blue wing hatches where everything's got to be perfect and the fish are counting the tail feathers on your fly before shrugging and not eating it. They were throwing themselves at our flies. In fact, Mike used the same size 18 Griffiths net for the entire hatch, and he was catching fish on it even when it had been chewed down to nothing but a single strand of black thread hanging off of his hook. I wouldn't have believed the stories, that story especially, if I hadn't have been there and witnessed this myself. And it is still, to this day, the single greatest blue wing hatch I have ever fished, and it's the top 5 most impressive hatches I've ever witnessed. The fish were big, they were willing to eat, they were incredibly less picky than usual about a perfect drift, and I've held this trip up as the ideal blue wing hatch, and I've spent a lot of time, a lot of gas money, and a lot of miles trying to find a blue wing hatch just like it. I haven't topped it, but I've come close a few times, and every time that I've come close, it's been a spring blue wing hatch. The fall hatches are good, but those spring hatches, there's something about them that's just a little bit more massive and epic. And not every spring fishing trip you take is going to be this legendary moment that you're going to do a podcast about. But The opportunity for an incredible experience like that is very, very real come spring. I mean, this is the time of year when the fish are finally waking up, the bugs are moving around, everything starts to eat again. It's like the fish are just happy that there's more variety to their diet than the same old worms, scuds, sow bugs, and midges they've been eating all winter long. And you can get into big fish during these spring hatches. You can get into tons of fish, or sometimes everything comes together and you get into tons of big fish. Regardless of what happens, though, the opportunity for an incredible day, like I said, is very real. And as I was getting ready for this show, I was thinking back on my most memorable fishing trips, and almost all of them have taken place during the spring. That's when I have had these big hatch experiences, or I've caught that surprisingly large fish that I had no business hooking into or landing. It just all seems to come together so well during the spring. Now, we're going to focus on how to actually fish these hatches in episode 118. That's next week's episode. But today, I really just wanted to share the fly patterns themselves. These are the flies that I use during the spring that just produce for me. They are consistently great. I don't leave the house without these flies. And if you are chasing trout anywhere this spring, I can almost guarantee they're going to work for you. And again, we'll get into exactly how to approach spring hatches next week, but let's take a look at these flies. Up first is our parachute blue-winged olive, or you can substitute that for a parachute Adams as well. I carry these in a lot of sizes from 14 down to 20 just to cover all my bases of how the hatch goes. And like I said, honestly, these early season blue-winged olives, they're often dark enough that an Adams is fine to imitate them, but I do have both the Adams and the blue wing in my box because on some tailwaters, the fish will get picky about the color. It's rare, but it happens, and you want to be prepared for that. So the next fly on the list is the Purple Haze. Now, funny story about the Purple Haze. I hated this fly for years and years because I always heard about how wonderful it was, and it catches every fish in the river. And, oh, Durrant, you got to try the Purple Haze. It's amazing. It's going to change your life. And I got so sick of hearing the hype about it that I said, well, I'm not going to fish that. I got a little stubborn, which I'm sure surprises some folks. But I didn't hate the fly. It was more that I hated the hype around it because folks made it sound like this wonder bug that could catch anything. And we know magic flies don't exist, but it was made out to be a magical fly. Well, a couple of years ago, Alex gave me a few, and I very reluctantly finally started fishing them, and they're a good fly. They work very well. Where I've found the best use for them, though, is in these spring mayfly hatches. This is where they shine for me because the spring mayfly hatches, they can get so thick. There can literally be thousands of real mayflies on the water, and when there's that many bugs on the water, how is your fake one supposed to stand out among all the real ones? Well, when you get into that situation, you can do what we call unmatching the hatch, and that's where the Purple Haze comes in. I like to use it a little bit larger, so if there's a bunch of 16s on the water, I'll throw a size 14 Purple Haze. And I think the combination of the larger size and the extra contrast you get from the purple body really makes that fly stand out, and the fish just seem to eat it with a bit more regularity. I've had this happen a few times on really pressured tailwaters during blue wing hatches. Had it happen just last year, as a matter of fact, where the fish were eating the duns, but they were refusing all of our very realistic imitations. So I tied on a Purple Haze that was slightly larger and just got into fish after fish after fish. So it's a very effective fly in those instances, and I would definitely recommend carrying one when you're out on the water for the spring. Our next one is going to be the Griffiths Gnat. This is a killer fly for midge hatches. It's not just mayflies that come off in the spring. You're going to have a lot of midges as well. That said, I did mention how my buddy Mike used a Griffiths Gnat for the entirety of a blue wing hatch and caught fish on it. I've seen that done. I've used it myself. especially when there's two hatches coming off at once. It can work really well. I do like this in a size 18 all the way down to a 22. I usually don't fish the 22s, but it's nice to have them just in case. And then it's often going to be the second fly for me in a double dry rig. That's how I like to fish it. Our next fly is going to be the Sparkle Dun. This is the goat of flies right here. This is my favorite fly. My box is almost all Sparkle Duns. That's all I've got. Okay, that's an exaggeration, but I do have quite a few. I really love them because they're so simple to tie. They float relatively well. They're an emerger pattern. So I am targeting that middle phase of the mayfly's life where it came up, it was a nymph underwater, and then it comes up and it's struggling to hatch into an adult, and it's shooting up through the water column. That's what the Sparkle Dun imitates. It's that emerger stage. I have them in 16s and 18s, but I usually only fish the 18s. They'll also be the second fly in a double dry fly rig for me, usually behind a parachute that's a little bit larger because I do want this Sparkle Dun to sink just a little bit. I've caught more spring fish on the Sparkle Dun than any other pattern. Probably all my other patterns put together. The Sparkle Dun just works for me. And I like to tie mine with a dark Adams or a dark orange body. But I always use the blue-winged olive colored beaver dubbing for the thorax. That little orange, I think, really pops, makes a little bit of contrast on the water. The blue wings aren't orange. They're a blue-winged olive, right? They're olive-bodied mayflies, but that orange, I think, really does catch the attention of some fish. Tends to work for me pretty well. Our next fly is another outstanding pattern. This is the Last Chance Cripple. Cripples are an easier target for fish than the duns because cripples can't escape the fish. So if the fish is sitting there and it's feeding and it sees a dun and a cripple coming at it, it's going to eat that cripple almost 9 times out of 10 because the dun could fly away. The cripple has a much lower chance of escaping, so it's more of a sure thing. Fish is going to go after that. And often, even in the middle of a hatch when the fish are eating the duns, I've caught them on the cripple for the entirety of the hatch because, again, it's such a sure thing in the fish's mind. I fish them pretty consistently. I like this pattern in particular in a size 16 down to an 18. The next one is going to be a bars emerger. Now, I like these unweighted, but if you have them with a bead, that's completely fine. I prefer them in sizes 16 to 18, and I fish them as a true dropper. I don't think of them as the second fly in a double dry fly rig. I don't want it that high in the water. I want it to be a nymph. I want it to be under the water. So that's how I'm fishing this fly. The idea is that you use this to target fish that are eating emergers, but they're not breaking the surface yet. Maybe you can see their backs just barely breaking the surface, but you never see their nose come out. Maybe you never even see their dorsal or tail fin. You can just see the fish flashing right below the surface. That's a great time to tie on a bars emerger. It's a very simple fly, and it just works incredibly well. Our next one is going to be very similar in use to the bars emerger, and that is the unweighted pheasant tail. Again, I will use this to accomplish the same thing as the bars emerger, but since this fly's got a little bit more to it, there's a bit more bulk to it, more pattern, more material that you use to tie it. I've found that it sinks just a little bit more, and you can use it to target the fish that are still eating nymphs, but maybe they're a little bit higher in the water column, or they're eating the emergers as well, but again, they're a little bit lower in the water column than the fish that are up really snacking on the emergers. I like these in a size 18, so I keep them pretty small. Up next is another little Midge dry fly, the Matt's Midge. Really just a fantastic Midge dry fly pattern. It works very well when the fish are just eating single flies. Sometimes in the spring and anytime there's a good midge hatch, you'll get big clumps of midges floating on the water, and a lot of fish will just come up and gulp all of them in one bite because, again, they're going to expend the energy to go eat off the top. It makes sense that they're going to go ahead and eat as many bugs as they can all at once. So you'll get these big clumps. But sometimes the fish will also be eating single midges. And in that instance, a Matt's midge is great. I like them in a size 16 to 20, just to cover all your bases for how big the midges are or how small they are, depending on where you're fishing. Our next fly is yet another midge, but this one's more of a midge emerger. This is the mother Shucker. It's really just a great little midge pattern. One of the best fly names ever, too. I love this fly. Great little bug, super easy to tie, and it works very well when the fish are eating midge emergers. Size 18 is my go-to with the mother Shucker. And then another one in this same vein of like a midge emerger is going to be the no-see-em. Now, I've used this fly when the fish are eating both mayflies and midges. It seems to work incredibly well in both situations. And if you look at this fly, it really imitates that midge. It looks like a midge body, especially with the black thread that it's tied with. But it also, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just the shape. Maybe it's how it rides in the water. Maybe the hackle that sticks straight up makes it look like an emerging mayfly. But I have had fish eat it during a mayfly hatch as well. I like it in a size 16 and an 18, and it's really, really simple to tie. But I will fish this as the second fly in a dry dropper rig, but you can certainly swing it almost like a wet fly as well. Our next fly is the zebra midge. No list of spring flies would be complete without the zebra midge. This is the goat midge nymph, one of the best nymphs ever. I like them in black, brown, and olive during the spring, and I got them in sizes 16 all the way to 20 just to cover the various sizes of midges that I see hatching out there. Our next fly is the Jujubatus. This is a fly, Charlie Craven came up with it, one of the best minds in fly tying right now, and it's a deadly little pattern, but I didn't really start fishing it until a couple of years ago, I think, is when I really started using it. It's a hyper-realistic mayfly nymph. It looks just like them, and it works very well early on in the mayfly hatch when the bugs aren't popping yet, the duns aren't coming off yet, but the fish are still eating nymphs. You can sink this. I have my best luck using this fly when I fish it a little bit deeper than my other mayfly nymph patterns. It just seems to work well for me when I fish it deeper, and I like it in a size 16 or 18. And then the spring list also wouldn't be complete if we didn't have a scud or a sow bug on the list. Any scud or sow bug pattern is going to work fine. I'm not really partial to any. I just use a whole lot. We do have our scud muffin here at VFC that is phenomenal, but I have that, and I have 3 or 4 other different scud patterns just for variety's sake more than anything else. And even though midges and mayflies, they're the main table fare come spring, the fish are still going to eat a scud or a sow bug, especially if you're fishing the lull in between hatches. You can get like a morning hatch and an afternoon hatch in the spring, especially with midges. And in between those hatches, the fish will still be snacking. Again, I keep a variety of colors and sizes and patterns in my box, usually in sizes 16 to 20, and then I like them in black, brown, orange, and tan. Those are my go-to colors. And last but not least is the egg bomber. This is a VFC fly. It does absolute work for us. Alex and I were out on the water last week, and he caught a couple on this when it was tough sledding. We weren't catching hardly any fish at all, period. It was just really, really tough fishing. But the reason I recommend an egg is spring is a time when the rainbows are spawning and the whitefish are spawning as well. So eggs are going to be present in the river system. That means fish are going to go ahead and eat eggs. Now, of course, you don't ever want to fish to spawning fish. So if you see fish that are actively on their reds, they're paired up together, they're spawning, you leave them alone. Don't walk through the reds, don't mess with them. But in the deeper runs and pools, you would be a fool to not drift an egg through there because there's eggs in the river system and the fish are going to go ahead and eat them. So you don't want to miss out on that. Just make sure when you're fishing your eggs, you're not bugging the fish that are actively spawning. Now, there also might be some specific patterns that work on your local fisheries. So I would check with fly shops or other anglers if you can, just to get the lowdown on maybe it's a zebra midge tied in a certain color or a certain size that just works because it imitates your local bugs just a little bit better than the generic stuff. But that, honestly, that's how I learned about the mother shucker. I was told about this from somebody on the lower Provo. That's where I believe it was developed as well. And it really does a great job with the buffalo midges that are there on the lower and the middle Provo for that matter. But it also works on a ton of other rivers too. So you do want to make sure you get as much local intel as you can. But regardless of if you get that or not, this is a really solid base of flies that'll have you catching fish this spring, no matter where you're at. So if you've got any questions about any of the flies that I talked about, please let me know. And then again, make sure you tune in next week because we are going to go over how to fish these flies and other tactics to help you have those unforgettable days on the water coming up this spring. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap up the open of the show, but don't go anywhere because we've got the Q&A section coming right up.
One of the most frequently asked questions we get from both beginners and experienced anglers is, what fly should I use? With the thousands of fly patterns that exist, it can be completely overwhelming. That's why we've put together an entire ebook that walks you through everything about bugs and picking the right fly no matter where you're fishing. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this ebook for free. All right, back to the show.
Every week here at Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. And often the questions y'all send in become the basis for the open of the show as well. So if you've got a question about fly fishing that you would like answered, please go ahead and send those in to us. There's a link to send those in via the show notes. And the first question this week comes to us, Paul from Idaho writes in and says, what's the difference between $30, $100, and $300 fly reels? Paul, that's a really good question. So the biggest difference that you're going to notice right off the bat between the cheap reels, the mid-priced reels, and the expensive reels is going to be build quality. The cheapest reels on the market are made from plastic. Now, that's fine to use if you don't ever plan to drop your reel or use your reel when it's cold. I've actually broken some plastic fly reels by dropping them on the rocks along with my fly rod. I drop things probably a bit more than I should. And I've even watched some plastic reels break or just refuse to work when it gets really cold outside. Now that's just no fun. You don't want to be in that situation. The drag on these reels is often pretty lousy too. It usually isn't very adjustable, so you'll either have no drag or a lot of drag. There's not that good in between, that Goldilocks spot you need to help tire a fish out and get it into your net. If the drag is set too tight, that can actually cause the fish to go ahead and break your tippet, and then you're going to be losing flies and fish, which is a double suck. You don't want that if you can avoid it. Another issue that these reels have is startup inertia. Now, startup inertia is how much energy it takes to engage the drag. The best reels have a very low startup inertia. Even when it's cranked down to the tightest setting, that drag will engage very smoothly. Okay, so it doesn't send shock waves down the line into the tippet and into the fish. The cheaper reels have a lot of startup inertia, so there's almost this hitch as the line pulls off the reel and the drag engages, and that hitch can actually introduce a bit of slack into your fly line. And if you've been following us here at Untangled for a while, you know that when slack gets introduced into the fight with the fish, chances are the fly is going to pop right out, and you're going to be left very frustrated because you lost a fish. And then again, when that hitch stops, when the the start opener should go is there's that big hitch. You get the slack in the line. If the fish stays on through that, when the fish puts the line under pressure again, it can cause another big shock that will break your leader or your tippet. Just a bad situation to be in. Cheaper reels are also a lot heavier than more expensive reels. It just costs more money to machine reels from aircraft grade aluminum than it does to cast reels out of cheap aluminum. So you'll pay more for the nicer, lighter stuff. Now, a heavy reel isn't awful. I wouldn't. It's hard for me to sit here and tell you that a heavy reel is a deal breaker. You will feel it. You'll feel a little bit more tired maybe at the end of the day using a heavy reel versus a light reel. It might affect the balance of your rod, and it might feel a little different when casting if you've got a really heavy reel versus a light reel. But this is the absolute least important of all the factors, in my opinion. The weight really, unless it's like a legitimate boat anchor, like if it's a full pound, that's way too heavy. But when we're talking the difference between an 8-ounce reel on the really heavy cheap end versus a 5-ounce reel on the expensive light end, it's a 3-ounce difference. It's not that big of a deal, in my opinion. The first major reel upgrade that I made, I had a plastic Reddington reel and I went to a Hardy. So that was a pretty huge jump in quality. It was like going from boneless wings at Applebee's to real wings at the Anchor Bar in Buffalo, New York, where they were invented. Well, that Hardy reel, it had a drag that was infinitely adjustable. So I could set it at any point from not engaged to fully engaged, and I could dial it in for a specific fish. It was wonderful. That old Reddington that I had like 3 or 4 preset drag stops. It was very clunky. It just wasn't smooth. It was fine for starting out, but it wouldn't cut it for more serious fishing. The drag on the Hardy was smooth. It was very easy to use, and it really helped put the brakes on some of the bigger trout that I've been able to catch. Now, all this is said with the giant caveat that for trout fishing, reels are almost always fancy line holders. You will very rarely use the reel to its full extent. You'll use it, but you'll very rarely use it to its full extent. So, with that in mind, don't feel like you need to drop a whole bunch of money on the reel. Put your money in the rod. That is where I recommend, and that's you're going to see the biggest bang for your buck if you put it in the rod. The reel, get something that's nice, but you don't need the really expensive stuff. You just don't. A middle-of-the-road option will work great for you. So hopefully that answers your question. Thanks a bunch for sending it in. John from California has our next question, writes in and says, "Hi, Spencer. I have 2 questions. First, I am learning how to tie flies, fresh and salt, and have taken 2 classes over the past year. Now, my instructor has been drilling into us about having the right proportions on our flies, and I get it. But what if I want to make a fly like a drake on a slightly larger hook and in a slightly larger size, but with the same relative proportions? Will a fish see my larger drake, larger than the average real drake fly, thinking they just hit the bug jackpot, or will they reject it because it's larger than they are used to?" John, thanks for the question. This is a good one. I like where your mind's at. I like how you're thinking about this. So the answer to your question, you're going to love this. It all really depends on the fish. And I know we say that all the time. It depends. That's the most common answer in fly fishing. You think we're talking about adult diapers, how many times we say, well, it depends. Well, here's the thing. Not every drake comes in the same size. So not every real life drake comes in the same size. You might see a bunch on the water that are size 12. And then one's going to come along that's a little bit bigger. It's closer to a size 10. Okay, there's a lot of uniformity in them, but they're not always exactly the same. And drakes can vary in size from river to river as well. There's one river around me here where the drakes are like a size 12. They're a little bit smaller. But then on another river, they're all much larger. They're closer to like a size 8, which is a pretty big drake. The goal should always be to closely imitate the natural bugs that you're seeing on the water. So you want a good variety of sizes to cover whatever you might run into. Generally, like I mentioned earlier, it can work well to go a size larger during a thick hatch with the blue-winged olives or the pale morning duns, like we mentioned earlier, because there's so many bugs on the water that your fake fly has very little chance of standing out among the naturals. But I've never been in a drake hatch that was that thick and heavy before. So in this case, I think you're just better off tying drakes that are in the sizes that occur in your local rivers. You could use a slightly larger drake as like an attractor, much in the way the elk hair stimulator works. It could be a great top fly in a dry dropper rig, but I would size away from oversizing what is normal for your area. Because again, your job as a fly angler is put a fly in front of a fish and make it look real. Part of making it look real is ensuring that it's a relatively good size match. Now, I'm not saying like if everything out there is a size 8 and the only thing you have is a size 10, fish the 10. It's going to be fine. But I wouldn't purposefully go out there if they're all size 10s and throw an 8 just because I'm thinking I'm going to catch more fish that way. I'm going to try and match what's actually on the water before I start thinking about unmatching the hatch. So hopefully that makes sense, John. Thanks a bunch for your question. Nick from Colorado's got our next question, writes in and says, "Hey Spencer, love the podcast. It is always nice to enjoy your fishy stories while I'm behind the desk at work. Thank you for all the entertainment you provide us, your listeners. My question revolves around destination fly fishing. There is a barrier to entry with cost, but I have been considering squirreling away some extra money for a trip. I'm looking at Alaska, Patagonia, or maybe even a trip to the salt flats to try my hand at saltwater fishing. If you could pick a dream fishing destination, where would you go? Again, thanks for the hours of entertainment. You deserve all the Diet Coke and chicken wings you can handle." Hey, Nick, great question. Thanks for sending it in. And my waistline is begging me to lay off the wings, so I'm either going to listen to you or my waistline. We'll see who wins out on this, and I ain't really sure. Well, Alex and I have actually been talking about this topic a lot lately. We kind of have Ferrari taste on like a Honda budget when it comes to destination fly fishing. So we've been dreaming trips up a bunch lately. But my dream trips are as follows, and these are in order as well. Number 1 on the list is time in Mongolia. Mongolia is one of the least sparsely populated countries on the planet. It's just got these enormous tracts of true wilderness. The Grand Tour episode where Clarkson, Hammond, and May are dropped in the Mongolian wilderness, they have to drive all the way to Moron, is incredible. And it showcases just how vast and empty Mongolia is. And I love that. I want to have that experience of being hours away from civilization, floating rivers, and just untrammeled scenery. And then, as if that's not great enough, there's the taimen. Okay, these are the biggest members of the trout family. And I recently read a story about someone catching a taimen that topped 100 pounds. 100-pound trout on a fly rod from a river. How friggin' epic is that? You seriously, you just can't top it, in my opinion. I don't know how you get better than that. The largest taimen ever recorded, this is really going to blow your mind, is 231 pounds and 83 inches long. Now, that record is not official, so the official IGFA, International Game Fish Association record, is 93 pounds. Still, a 93-pound taimen, that's insane. I want to experience that so bad. They can also live for more than 50 years. They're just a truly amazing fish. So that is top of my list. My next trip would be, after taimen, would be up to the far north. I want to go well above the Arctic Circle, either in Canada or Alaska, and I want to go after Arctic char. They're just gorgeous fish. They live in really wild places, and I love the idea of holding like a 10-plus pound char that's colored up like a traffic cone. I really want to have that experience for myself. And then the last one, rounding out my top 3, is going to be tiger fish in Africa. Again, crazy wild location and probably the wildest fish you can catch on a fly rod. These tiger fish are crazy. They got those giant teeth. They don't get enormous. You've got the Goliath tigerfish that you can catch, but I don't know if folks are doing that on a fly rod. I need to do some digging. It'd be cool to catch a Goliath tigerfish on a fly. But even though the regular tigerfish doesn't get huge, again, they live in cool places. They've got those giant teeth. They just look mean and angry. Fishing for them just looks like a ton of fun. There's a lot of fish I'd love to fish for in Africa, but tigerfish are at the top of the list. So hopefully, Nick, I either gave you some ideas and clarified some things, or I just made your decision even harder on where you decide you want to go. But either way, thanks for letting me talk about that for a minute. It's fun to dream. I appreciate it. And with that, folks, we are going to wrap up the Q&A section for the show, but don't go anywhere because we've got the Live Real Life moment coming right up. Every week, we end the show with a story from someone who's been out on the water living real life. These are stories and pictures submitted from the VFC community, and we love to hear and see everything you're doing out on the water. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment that you would like to submit, you can do that at the link in the show notes. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Colby. Writes in and says, being from Texas, fly fishing for trout is not something we do often. However, my wife and I quite often check out the scenery in the mountains, streams, and rivers year-round. This summer, we spent a week in Colorado, and I spent a few days fishing the Blue River with spinning tackle. I had an absolute blast. The passion was set to chase these trout on all our adventures. I recently purchased my first fly rod. I had spent about a week watching the masterclass videos, and then it hit me to strike off to Mountain Fork River in Oklahoma just to fish for a few hours. I showed up, saw what the other guys were using, and tied up a dry dropper, elk hair caddis with a yellow egg underneath. After a few casts and misses, I finally hooked into my first ever fish on the fly rod. I caught this beautiful rainbow trout. I could not have been prepared to hit the water without your guys' guidance through the master classes. I look forward to going down this rabbit hole that you guys have poured the fuel to fire on. Colby, that's awesome. I love it. Love the fish. Love that you went out there and just did it. That's cool. Well, it's really easy to get caught up in the planning stages of it, especially when it's something you haven't done. You want to make sure it goes right, but you just went for it. I love that. Man, that's awesome. Congrats, and you're welcome for opening the rabbit hole and showing it to you. So I hope you enjoy your time here. I really, thanks for the kind words you said about our master classes. I really appreciate that. And with that, folks, we're going to wrap things up today. Thank you so much for listening to the entire show. It really means a lot to me and to the whole crew here at VFC. And if you could, please make sure you rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get means the more folks we reach and can help them live real life. And speaking of living real life, we've got tons of links to all of our other content that can help you in your fly fishing journey. Click on them wherever you see them. And until next week, everybody, get out on the water, enjoy yourself, and live real life.